Montana Territory, 1877. The snow was still thick on the ground when they left her to die. Keziah Dalton pressed her back to the cold rock wall, clutching the threadbare shawl around her shoulders as the wagon disappeared down the crooked trail. She watched until it was only a smudge of dust against the white land, her heart pounding so loud she thought it might crack her ribs. "You are too ugly to be any good to us," her uncle had said, his mouth twisting in disgust. "No man will ever want you." Keziah lifted trembling fingers to the jagged scar that ran from her left temple down across her cheekbone and to the corner of her mouth, a cruel reminder of the fire that had taken her parents and left her disfigured at 12 years old. She had learned not to cry. Tears only made the scar itch and burn worse. So she stood there, silent as the cold gnawed through her shoes and the last of her family drove away. The wind howled low through the canyon, carrying the sharp scent of pine and smoke. Somewhere, not too far, someone had a fire. She stumbled forward, her knees buckling under her. She was not going to die here, not like this. By nightfall, Keziah was half frozen and half blind from exhaustion. But she followed the thin trail of smoke like a dying moth to a flame, until she collapsed behind a stand of juniper trees overlooking a small valley. Down below, a man worked near a cabin. He was tall, lean, moving with the easy strength of someone who had lived his whole life outdoors. His dark hair fell over his forehead as he chopped wood, the axe rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Keziah tried to call out, but her voice cracked into nothing. The world tilted. She fell face first into the snow. The next thing she knew, warmth was pressing against her skin. A heavy coat was thrown over her. She blinked up into the face of the man she had seen, a stranger with deep-set blue eyes and a mouth pulled tight with worry. "God Almighty," he muttered, "you are half dead." He lifted her like she weighed nothing, cradling her against his chest. His coat smelled of leather and wood smoke. She wanted to tell him she was not worth saving, that she was ugly and broken and would only bring him trouble. But the darkness swallowed her before she could even try. Keziah woke to the creak of a rocking chair and the hiss of a fire. She was tucked under rough wool blankets on a narrow bed. Her whole body hurt, but there was a clean, steady warmth in the room that steadied her heart. The man was sitting across from her, mending a saddle strap. He looked up when she stirred. "You are awake," he said simply. His voice was rough but not unkind. She tried to sit up, but the dizziness knocked her back. "Easy," he said, setting the strap aside. "You have been out for nearly 2 days. Starving. Frozen. You are lucky I found you." Keziah swallowed hard. I did not mean to trespass." He gave a short shake of his head. "You were not trespassing. You were surviving." She stared at him, too tired to argue. "I am Orin Daugherty," he said after a moment, offering his hand. "Keziah Dalton," she whispered. Her voice sounded small and cracked. Orin's hand was firm and warm. He squeezed once, then let go. He did not flinch when his eyes passed over the scar on her face. If he noticed it at all, he gave no sign. "You have a place to stay here until you get your strength back," he said. "No one will bother you." Tears burned behind her eyes, but she blinked them away. She nodded, clutching the blanket tighter. The days passed in a slow, careful rhythm. Orin was a rancher, she learned. He worked a stretch of land that had been in his family for 2 generations, running cattle and breaking horses. There were no other souls for miles, just him, a few hired hands who came and went, and now her. Keziah helped where she could. She mended torn shirts, stirred stew over the fire, and fed the chickens. She wore her hair low over her face, hiding the scar as best she could. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch shelling beans, Orin spoke. "You do not have to hide from me." Keziah froze, her hands clenching around the pot. "I know about your scar," he said. "I saw it the first night." She kept her head down. "It does not scare me," he said. Her throat tightened. "Everyone else thinks I am cursed. Everyone else is a damned fool," Orin said, his voice low and fierce. She looked up, then really looked at him. His face was weathered from sun and wind, his hands scarred from years of hard work. He was not a man who spoke easy words. If he said something, he meant it. For the first time in years, Keziah felt something crack open inside her, a small, trembling hope. Spring came slow that year, the snow melting into thick mud and the air turning sweet with the scent of new grass. Keziah was in the barn mending a harness when she heard the frantic pounding of hooves. She rushed outside in time to see a small figure tumble from a shaggy pony. It was a boy, no older than 8, his cheeks red from hard riding. "Please," he gasped. "Help! My sister, she fell into the river." Orin was already moving, grabbing his rifle and swinging onto his horse. He turned to Keziah. "Stay here," he commanded, but she was already running for the second horse. "I am coming," she said, her voice steady. He hesitated a fraction of a second, then nodded. They followed the boy, whose name was Micah, down to the swollen river. On the far side, tangled in the roots of a fallen tree, was a little girl, her dress caught and pulling her under. Keziah did not think. She threw off her boots and plunged into the icy water. The current was brutal, slamming her against rocks, but she fought her way to the girl. Her fingers locked onto the child's arm and she kicked hard, dragging them both to the bank where Orin hauled them out. The girl coughed and sputtered, then wailed a good, loud, living sound. Micah sobbed with relief, clinging to his sister. Keziah knelt in the mud, shaking from cold and adrenaline. Orin dropped down beside her, pulling her into his arms without a word. "You saved her," he said into her hair. "So did you," she whispered. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his thumb brushing a wet strand of hair from her scarred cheek. His eyes were so blue it hurt to look at them. "You are the bravest woman I have ever met," he said, his voice rough. Keziah could not breathe. She thought he might kiss her, but he only held her closer, his hand steady against her back. For the first time, she let herself believe. Maybe she was not cursed. Maybe she was meant for something more. Maybe, just maybe, she was meant for him. The river still rushed heavy from the winter thaw, but the skies had softened and the days carried the first true heat of spring. Keziah stood by the corral, watching as Orin worked a young sorrel gelding through its first lessons under a saddle. The horse tossed its head, muscles bunching and shivering, but Orin moved with patient steadiness, never raising his voice, never jerking the reins. "You were stubborn," Keziah said under her breath, "but you picked the right teacher." Orin heard her and chuckled low as he led the horse in a wide circle. "Takes one to know one." She smiled without thinking, a small, startled thing that faded quickly when she caught his eyes on her. He did not look away. "You should come help," he said, tossing her a length of lead rope. She caught it clumsily, feeling the roughness of the hemp scrape her palms. "I have never broken a horse before." "Neither had I once," he said. "You will learn." The sorrel shied as she approached, nostrils flaring, but she kept her movement slow, her voice low. Orin stayed close enough she could feel his presence like a steadying hand even when he did not touch her. "Good," he said after a long moment. "Animals know when someone means them no harm." Keziah rested her hand lightly on the horse's shoulder, feeling the tremble ease from the gelding skin. She dared a glance at Orin. His face was calm, but there was a warmth there, not just approval, but something deeper, like pride. Later, when the horse was cooling in the paddock and the sun was sinking behind the hills, Keziah and Orin sat on the porch steps, the dust of the day's work still clinging to them. "You ever think about leaving this place?" she asked, her fingers picking at the splintered edge of the step. He leaned back on his elbows, looking out over the fields. "Used to. After my brother died, I thought there was nothing left worth staying for. But the land's in my blood. Leaving would be like cutting off my own arm." She nodded, understanding more than she could say. "I thought I had no place to belong. Maybe I still don't." Orin turned his head, studying her with a seriousness that made her throat tighten. "You belong exactly where you are." The words settled deep in her chest, heavier than any stone, but warmer too. The next morning, Keziah rose early, drawn by the sound of hammering. She found Orin by the shed, working a bent horseshoe back into shape. His shirt sleeves were rolled to his elbows, and the sweat on his brow caught the first light of dawn. Without thinking, she crossed the yard and picked up a second hammer. He glanced at her, eyebrows lifting slightly, but said nothing as she set to work beside him. The rhythm of it was different than sewing or cooking, but no less satisfying. Keziah felt the vibration of each strike through her arms, grounding her, anchoring her to the moment. "You ever think about staying here?" Orin asked, not looking up. She missed a beat with the hammer, but recovered quickly. "I would not want to be a burden." "You are not," he said simply. She swallowed hard, the heat from the forge washing over her face. "You barely know me." "I know enough," he said. "You work hard. You don't scare easy. You have more grit than most men I have met." She set her hammer down carefully, the weight of his words settling over her. "I do not have much to offer," she said. "No dowry, no fine manners." Orin finally set his own hammer aside and turned to face her fully. "I am not looking for fine manners. I am looking for someone who will stand with me when the winter comes hard and the cattle are lost and the world seems bent on breaking a man. I am looking for someone who will not leave when things turn ugly." Keziah felt her heart hammering harder than any forge tool. "I have nothing to give but myself." He stepped closer, his hands rough and sure as he took hers. "That is everything." The forge fire crackled behind them, throwing long shadows across the yard. Keziah stood very still as Orin raised one hand to her cheek, tracing the line of her scar with a tenderness that undid her completely. "I see you," he said, his voice low. "All of you." She closed her eyes, letting herself lean into his touch, trusting him to hold her steady. "I would stay," she whispered. "If you would have me." "I would," he said, and there was no hesitation in him, none at all. Around them, the land stretched wide and open, and for the first time in her life, Keziah felt the solid weight of belonging settle into her bones. The wedding was a quiet thing, held on a cool morning when the wild lupins were just beginning to bloom along the creeks. Reverend Alden, who rode circuit between scattered homesteads, agreed to stop by after Sunday service at the nearest town, some 20 miles off. Keziah wore a simple dress of faded blue calico mended at the hem where it had frayed. Orin had brushed the dust from his best shirt, but his boots were still scuffed from the week's work. Neither seemed to notice. They stood under the open sky with nothing but the wind and the sweet scent of early blossoms for company. Micah and his little sister, Ruth, watched solemnly from the porch, their small hands clasped together. "Do you come of your own will?" Reverend Alden asked, his voice carrying over the rustle of grass. "I do," Orin said. His gaze never wavered. Keziah's fingers trembled slightly as she answered, "I do." When it was done, Orin reached for her hand, his thumb brushing along her knuckles as if sealing the vow into her skin. No one clapped or cheered, but the peace that settled into Keziah's chest was louder than any celebration. After the Reverend rode off, Orin led her to the corral where a young mare waited, her coat gleaming like polished copper. "She's yours," Orin said. "You will need a good horse if you are going to ride this land with me." Keziah stared, speechless. No one had ever given her anything without expecting something back. She touched the mare's neck, feeling the strong, steady thrum of life beneath the hide. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with feeling. "You are my wife now," Orin said simply. "What is mine is yours." They spent the afternoon riding the property, the horses moving easily over the soft earth. Orin showed her the line of cottonwoods that marked their northern boundary and the stretch of rocky hills where antelopes sometimes gathered. "This land will be ours to work," he said as they reined in by a rise overlooking the valley. "It will not be easy, but nothing worth having ever is." Keziah looked out over the fields, the river winding silver through the grass, the mountains standing like sentinels in the distance. For the first time, the future did not seem like a thing to fear. "You are not afraid I will fail you?" she asked. Orin rested his hand against her back, a steady weight. "You would not be standing here if you were the kind to quit." As the sun fell low, they returned to the house, the sky burning gold and crimson. Ruth had picked a handful of wildflowers and left them in a jar on the table. Micah had swept the porch clean without being asked. Inside, Keziah stirred the evening stew while Orin repaired a broken chair rung. There was no grand celebration, no feast or dance, but there was a warmth in the room that filled every hollow place inside her. Later, as they sat by the fire, Keziah stitched a new patch onto Orin's work shirt. His hand brushed against hers as he reached for his coffee, and instead of pulling away, she let her fingers linger. "You have steady hands," he said. "I used to think they were only good for mending things," she murmured. He laid his hand over hers, rough palm against calloused knuckles. "You mend more than shirts, Keziah. You mend hearts." She looked up and for once did not shy away from the way he studied her, scar and all. "You are my best choice," he said, the firelight carving lines of honesty into his face. "I did not know it at first, but I see it now, plain as day." Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them away, not wanting to miss a single moment. "And you are mine," she said. The fire crackled low, the wind brushed against the windows, and the stars began to gather outside. Inside the small house, two people, battered by the world but unbroken, built something stronger than either had ever known, a home. Summer settled over the land slow and heavy, bringing long days thick with the sweet smell of clover and the low hum of bees in the fields. Keziah woke early each morning, her body already learning the rhythms of ranch life, the creak of saddle leather, the measured slap of a shovel against earth, the quiet patience required to mend a fence line under the relentless sun. One afternoon, while Orin was off riding the southern pasture, she set about scrubbing the smoke stains from the cabin walls. She had stripped down to her shift, the fabric clinging to her damp skin, her hair pinned up to keep it off her neck. Ruth sat nearby, humming tunelessly as she stitched a new doll from scraps of muslin. Micah burst through the door, tracking dust across the clean floor. "Stranger coming up the road," he said, eyes wide. Keziah dried her hands quickly and stepped onto the porch. A figure on horseback was picking his way up the trail, a thin man with a narrow face shaded by a battered hat. He drew up short when he caught sight of her. "You Mrs. Daugherty?" he called. "I am," she said cautiously. He dismounted stiffly, pulling a folded paper from his vest. "Message for your husband. From town." She hesitated before taking it, noting the dust and wear on the man's boots, the way he kept glancing toward the hills as if expecting trouble. "Thank you," she said, and he tipped his hat without meeting her eyes, mounting up and riding off before she could ask anything more. Micah hovered at her elbow. "What does it say?" "I will wait for Orin," she said, folding the paper carefully and slipping it into her apron pocket. By the time Orin returned, the sky was bruised with twilight. His shirt was streaked with sweat and trail dust, but his smile when he saw her standing by the gate was easy and sure. "Something came for you," she said, handing him the paper. He wiped his hands against his trousers before taking it. His brow furrowed as he read, the lines around his mouth tightening. Keziah waited, feeling the slow creep of unease. "That was from Nathaniel Harper," Orin said finally. "Old friend of my father's. He is getting on in years. Wants to sell off his land and move east to live with his daughter." She searched his face. "Does he want you to buy it?" "He offered it to me first, said my father would have wanted it to stay in the family." Keziah's heart thudded. "Can we manage it?" Orin folded the paper carefully. "It will stretch us thin. Real thin. But it would double our grazing land." She thought of the lean winter Orin had spoken of, the risk of cattle starving when snow buried the grass, the way he sometimes stared across the current fields as if seeing their limits. "If it is worth it," she said slowly, "we will find a way." He looked at her then, something raw and grateful flickering in his eyes. "You sure? I did not marry you to sit idle, Orin Daugherty," she said, lifting her chin. "If it needs doing, we will do it together." He crossed the space between them in 2 strides and pulled her against him, his kiss tasting of dust and sun and fierce, steady promise. Over the next weeks, they worked harder than ever. Keziah took on more of the daily chores, freeing Orin to ride back and forth between their land and Harper's, hammering out details and setting up the transfer. Ruth and Micah helped where they could, gathering eggs, fetching water, tending the small garden Keziah had coaxed into life behind the house. One evening, as the sun sank low and the air turned cool enough to breathe easy, Keziah and Orin sat on the back step sharing a plate of cold biscuits and honey. "You ever think you would end up here?" Orin asked, brushing a crumb from his shirt. She watched the fireflies blinking over the fields, feeling the solid earth beneath her bare feet. "No," she said honestly. "I thought the world was done with me." He turned, resting his arm along the step behind her. "World's a fool, then. You are the strongest woman I know." Keziah set her biscuit aside and leaned into him, her head finding the hollow of his shoulder as naturally as breathing. "I was strong enough to survive. Maybe now I will be strong enough to thrive." "You already are," he said, pressing a kiss to her hair. They sat there until the stars thickened overhead, the quiet hum of night wrapping around them like a second skin. Keziah felt the last edges of her old life slough away, leaving only this a man who saw her true, a land wide enough to hold all her dreams, and a future she was no longer afraid to claim. The days shortened as summer bled into autumn, and the hills turned from green to gold. The new land Harper sold them stretched wide and rough, spotted with rocky outcrops and deep draws where the cattle liked to hide. It would take years to tame fully, but it was theirs, and that knowledge settled into Keziah like a slow-burning fire. One afternoon, Keziah rode out with Orin to the northern edge where a small, clear spring bubbled up between two limestone ridges. They dismounted, letting the horses drink, and stood side by side, gazing over the valley below. "I want to build a second barn here come spring," Orin said, shifting his hat back to wipe his brow. "Closer to the high pasture. Save a day's ride when we bring the herd down." Keziah squatted by the water, trailing her fingers through the cool flow. "We will need to plant more hay, too," she said. "Enough to see the herd through a hard winter." He crouched beside her, studying her face with a kind of quiet pride. "You talk like you have been ranching your whole life." "I listen," she said lightly. "You do enough talking for both of us." He chuckled, low and genuine. "Takes a sharp mind to listen right." They sat a while, the breeze combing through the grass, the horses cropping quietly nearby. After a time, Orin shifted, pulling a small, battered pouch from his jacket. "I have something for you," he said, awkward in a way she'd never seen before. She wiped her hands on her skirt and took the pouch. Inside was a ring, simple and strong, hammered from gold so pale it caught the light like a drop of sun. "I know we did not have one before," he said, voice low. "Was not about to wait another day back then. But you should have a proper ring." Keziah turned it over in her fingers, the weight of it steady and sure. "It is more than proper," she said. "It is perfect." He took her hand, sliding the ring onto her finger. It fit as if it had been made for her. "You are not a woman who needs pretty things to prove her worth," he said. "But you deserve them all the same." Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them away fiercely. She leaned in, pressing her forehead to his, the two of them balanced there above the wide, waiting land. That night, after the evening chores were finished and Ruth and Micah were tucked into bed, Keziah and Orin sat by the hearth. A new quilt, pieced together from old shirts and feed sacks, draped over their laps. The fire cracked low, throwing soft light around the room. "I have been thinking," Orin said, his hand tracing idle circles on her knee, "about building on a room come spring. Give the young ones more space. Maybe make room for more besides." Keziah stilled, her heart catching in her throat. "You mean?" He smiled, slow and certain. "I mean I would like a house full of laughter. Full of life. If you were willing." She laid her hand over his, feeling the strength there, the steadiness. "I would like that too." The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Outside, the night stretched wide and quiet, the stars thick and near enough to touch. Years later, when the house stood broader and sturdier, with a wide porch and a second barn rising proud against the sky, Keziah would think back to that moment. To the way Orin had looked at her not as something broken, but as something whole and strong and beloved. In the seasons that followed, the ranch grew. Ruth and Micah stayed on, becoming as much a part of the land as the river and the cottonwoods. New hands joined them, and with them came new friendships, new stories. Keziah bore a daughter first, with hair dark as the rich earth and eyes the color of deep water. Orin held the tiny, wailing bundle as if she were made of spun glass, his big hands trembling as he whispered her name into the crook of her neck. In the winters, they gathered close around the fire, laughter and the smell of baking bread filling the cabin. In the summers, they rode out together, checking fences, mending roofs, harvesting hay under a sky so wide it seemed to swallow the world. Keziah never wore fine gowns or danced in grand ballrooms. She wore sturdy boots and sun-bleached dresses, her hands rough from work, her cheeks browned by the wind. But every night, when Orin reached for her, when he brushed his calloused hand over her scarred cheek and smiled that quiet, steady smile that was hers alone, she knew she had found something finer than any riches. She had found home, and she was loved, fiercely, truly, forever.